Kia ora tātou katoa. Pardon the slight delay. Technical matters were taking precedent. Te he Māori ora. Tēnei tā kātou te raro ka te maru o ka mana whenua, ka te mamoi, waitaha kaitai, tāhu, no mai haere mai tauti mai. I stand here beneath the cloak of the people of this place, ka te mamoi, waitaha kaitāhu, and welcome you all. E na mana e na reo au rakatira mā tēnā koutou, tēnā rā katoa a kauaiao, no Otapoti ahau, ko Katarani te iwi, he kaimai ahau, o tāko whakaiho waka ko Richard Blakey Takawingawa. Good evening everyone, I'm Richard Blakey, Deputy Vice Chancellor Research and Enterprise, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this, the Rowheath Trust Award and Carl Smith Medal Lecture to be presented by, and then the awards and the medal to be given to Associate Professor Anna High from the Faculty of Law. Congratulations Anna on a most well-deserved award. It's my great pleasure to share the celebration of outstanding research achievement with you all, friends and whānau of our medal recipient, here in person and online and in the present and in the future for those that are watching the podcast. Welcome, welcome, welcome all. Particular welcome to distinguished guests and special friends of Anna. Ryan, your partner, is here. Thank you for supporting Anna in this. We have Dr. Royden Somerville, former Chancellor. Welcome Royden and Lee, and others I think you may acknowledge during the course of events. The order of ceremonies is that I'll say a few words and invite Professor Shelley Griffiths, the Dean of the Faculty of Law, to introduce Anna for the lecture. Following the lecture, I'll give a summary and vote of thanks, and then, provided the lecture is of suitable, impressive nature, we will invite the Vice-Chancellor to present you with your award and medal and a special gift that we might talk about at that time before we retire to the Staff Club for refreshments and fellowship. But first, some background to the Carl Smith Medal and the Rowheath Trust Award. The purpose of these, which began in 2003 and are always awarded together, is very clear. They are to, quote, to promote research at the University of Otago and to give recognition to outstanding research performance of early career staff, which is for those who have been at Otago for at least 2 years, but have total research career appointments of less than 10 years. It's the research experience and not age that is the defining factor. So why an award and a medal? Well, it's very simply, one is for the money and one is for the glory. The Rowheath Trust, established in 1964 to support the work of the university by Carl Smith, a prominent Dunedin businessman and member of the University Council, was used to endow a $5,000 research support award that bears the Trust's name. At the same time, the university commissioned a medal in Sir Carl's honour as the glory to accompany the money. And it gives the university a very good opportunity to recognise the contributions of Sir Carl and his wife, Lady Catherine, that they made over many years after coming to New Zealand from the family estate of Rowheath in Birmingham, hence the name, the Rowheath Trust Award. And the reason for coming here was for operations in one of the other great Dunedin institutions, the Cadbury factory. And I think there is a book that Sir Carl wrote on the history of that institution. The family connection to the university and the ward continued with Sir Carl's daughter Catherine living locally and being a regular attendee at these awards up until a few years ago. And it was a great privilege to be able to invite Catherine to be able to present the award when she was able. Finally, as something of a aside, Sir Carl is a well-known author, not so much for sweet success, his history of the Cadbury maker, Cadbury Fry Hudson, published in 1968, but also, and we do have a copy here, and you will be presented with it, his quirky and humorous tome, New Zealand from N to Z, that we will also present you, and you can do with what you wish. This is not in press anymore, so that may be a rare item. Anyway, congratulations very much, Anna. The selection panel always has a hard job to do to look at the wide range of outstanding early career research that is undertaken at the university and make a wise selection. You are a very, very good selection, and we're very pleased to be able to present this award to you. So without further ado, I would now like to invite Professor Shelley Griffiths to formally introduce you and to invite you to give the 2024 Carl Smith Medal Lecture. Thank you very much.
katoa, ko Shelley Griffith, toko ingoa. I'm currently the Dean of the Faculty of Law. And thank you for coming to this evening, this particularly glorious Dunedin evening, to celebrate with Anna High and to congratulate her on receiving this award. As Dean of Law, I feel it's incumbent upon me to say this is not the first member of the Faculty of Law in the past 20 years who has received this award. One is in the audience, and at least one, I believe, is online. So if anybody thinks that law is not a place of high quality research, you're absolutely wrong. Anna graduated in law in Chinese from the University of Queensland and went on to pursue postgraduate study as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University. There she completed MPhil and DPhil degrees in Chinese law at the Centre for Socio-Legal Studies. It was there she met Ryan, which is most likely the reason why her first academic roles were in the United States, at Marquette University and at Loyola University Chicago. Almost exactly 70 years ago now, Anna and her family, now with Maggie, who was very, very small then, came to the Faculty of Law at the University of Otago. Her doctoral thesis was the basis of a monograph completed in her early years at Otago called Non-Governmental Orphan Relief in China, for which she received the Asian Law and Society Association Annual Book Award. Anna's academic position at Otago involves teaching evidence. Evidence is the core to the resolution of legal issues. For the watchers of TV dramas, that is when counsel in the US leap to their feet and shout, "Objection." It is some matter of evidence to which they are objecting, either the form or the manner of its reporting. Evidence is fundamental to the law and to the resolution of legal disputes. Since she has come to New Zealand, she has developed a research portfolio as well as her teaching in evidence, and is now respected across Aotearoa as an expert on the law of evidence. This seems to be a natural fit with the extensive work that she has also done on issues in sexual violence, with particular interest in the role of dignity and mana in that area of law. Her work in these areas has seen her win a number of prizes and awards: a Royal Society Te Aparangi Early Career Research Award, and the 2 significant New Zealand Legal Writing Awards. Anna has broad and interrelated interests and work. She describes herself as a socio-legal scholar who takes a law in action approach. That is to say, she has a research approach that examines and considers not only learning about the rules of the law, sounds ominous, but also about how the rules have evolved to address social concerns and how they actively operate in the real world. Please welcome Anna High to deliver the 2024 Rowheath Trust and Carl Smith Research Medal Lecture on Evidence in Law and Academia. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Kutha te Munga, ko Maiwa te awa I tipu mai o I Australia, ke koputai o te poti tōku kainga I Naiane, ko Anna High tōku ingoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora. Ngā mihi for those very kind words of introduction. Vice Chancellor, DVCs, Pro-Vice Chancellors, colleagues and friends, it's really wonderful to see you all here today. Thank you for coming out on such a beautiful evening to be here. Ngā mihi nui. So I've chosen for today's lecture to focus on the theme of proof Proving a Point is my title. What is proof? What is evidence? Shelley's somewhat stolen my thunder here, though, I should say. Speaking to both the legal question, that was a useful primer, the rules of evidence in law, and also to questions of proof that arise in both research and academia. So evidence is what warrants a belief that something is true. Evidence is proof. Evidence makes the existence of something, such as a defendant's guilt or a research hypothesis, more or less likely to be true. So in other words, evidence is something that has probative value, a tendency to prove or disprove something that is of interest to us. And evidence law, which, as Shelley said, is one of my major areas of research, is the set of rules and principles that govern whether a particular piece of evidence will be rejected or admissible. Can it be relied on by typically a jury in court proceedings? Now, I spend a great deal of my time reading a relentless, never-ending stream of judgments, mostly from the Supreme Court, Court of Appeal, also the High Court. It's quite a large volume of evidence law judgments on various doctrinal, black letter, very technical details of evidence law, much of which, as I was keenly aware in deciding what to speak about today, is not of particular interest outside the legal profession, or indeed if you're not an evidence nerd like myself. Nonetheless, I did decide to choose proof as the theme for today's lecture, and I will speak to some of those legal issues, but I'm thinking about the theme more broadly, including in relation to my earliest postgraduate work, which was in Chinese law, based on fieldwork there, and also in relation to academia. But first, I thought some background on how I came to be focusing on evidence law would be of interest, because it is a bit of a pivot from my early China focus. And this really arose because Otago really values research-led teaching, and when I arrived 7 years ago, I was given the evidence law paper to teach, somewhat unexpectedly. This was not mentioned in my interview, although I'm actually really grateful for it, because it's given me a lot of opportunities to work with amazing students and practitioners and judges across the motu, which has been really enjoyable. And Mark Hennigan being the dean at the time, for those of you who know him, with his typical exuberance and utmost faith in people, he not only asked me to take on evidence law very shortly after arriving in Aotearoa, not having any familiarity with this legal jurisdiction, but he also excitedly told me that he'd signed me up to teach the judges evidence law that same year. Fortunately for me, Fred's, my son's somewhat unexpected arrival gave me a bit of breathing room on that front. Of course, I guess it shows agility is important in academia, and I'm sure the same is true in all of your disciplines. We in law are constantly telling our students, we can't teach you every area of law, we can teach you legal methods, we can teach you how to think and reason like a lawyer, and I'll have more to say on what that means. All of that to say, evidence law is a relatively new area of research and teaching for me. But I think these ideas of proof, evidence, probative value, these are salient in research more generally. So, to go back some time, my PhD, as mentioned, was in Chinese law. I began doing my fieldwork in 2009 at Oxford Centre for Socio-Legal Studies. I did further fieldwork. That made it sound like I did the fieldwork at the Centre for Socio-Legal Studies. I did it in China. I was based at the Centre for Socio-Legal Studies. I did further fieldwork in 2010, and then just prior to joining Otago in 2017. And that time I had my baby daughter with me. And this work was studying over time the tenuous negotiated existence of quasi-legal orphanages in China, caring for mostly abandoned children, most of whom had disabilities. These orphanages are often affiliated with so-called underground churches, although that's a bit of a misnomer. And there are some photos up on the board. The homes that I visited really varied quite widely in terms of funding, resourcing, visibility, size, location, being rural or urban. Some were local Chinese run, others were run by foreign missionaries with all of the complexities that involves in China. And at the time of that initial fieldwork and writing the PhD, these organisations were technically, officially illegal. They were not allowed to exist. They were outside of that legal framework for charities, for NGOs. And formally, the state had a monopoly on institutional care for orphans. And that, of course, raises really significant implications for the children resident in these homes, but it also raised some really interesting law and society questions about how state actors were regulating these organisations that were ostensibly illegal, but they weren't in hiding, and they did have quite extensive interactions with the state at different levels, particularly at that grassroots level. So I was really interested in looking at what are the norms, the rules, the expectations, the local dynamics and politics that were at play in this social field. How did these organisations deal with being illegal? What were the practical ramifications of that? Did they see themselves as illegal? Did they care about that label? Is the legal-illegal binary even a relevant dichotomy or an important binary in the Chinese context? And you can read the book to get answers to all of those questions I've just posed. Because my point in bringing this up is that this did also, of course, involve looking for evidence. So observations from fieldwork, interviews, participant observation, and looking for the evidence, drawing conclusions based on that evidence about how this little world, this social sphere was structured, and then thinking about the implications of those observations and evidence and conclusions for studies of Chinese law more generally. And in terms of proof, that required, as those of you who have done fieldwork will know, it required being really mindful of both preconceived theories and hypotheses, like is this evidence or is this confirmation bias, but also the impact of my own presence there in the field as a researcher. So that identity as a researcher and all the other identities that I also brought with me. So for example, I was there as a former volunteer. I was a foreigner, but I was a foreigner who at the time spoke Chinese. I was a person with some shared beliefs with some of the participants, and therefore there's a whole other kind of common language that you have. And I was also later there as a mother. So I was also always needing to be really mindful of being both an insider and an outsider in the field, thinking through how to account for that in my reading of the evidence, which I think points to how evidence gathering is not a value-neutral process, and questions around reliability, replicability, representativeness arise, and the intersubjectivity of the researcher and the subject of study must be accounted for. This is Maggie on our last fieldwork trip. Just on that note, thinking about intersubjectivity, it's admittedly somewhat cliched, but things did really hit differently when I went back to do fieldwork in 2017 as a mother. I had Maggie with me. I was reminded that a lot of time had passed, which is really interesting in terms of what I was noticing and what had happened in that field. But I was also being received differently because time had passed. So for example, this really hit home when all of the children I was speaking to on this trip spontaneously, uniformly referred to me as Ana Ayi rather than Ana Jieje. So Auntie Anna, not Big Sister Anna. A bit of a blow, but time had passed. I was also really more aware on that last trip of how fieldwork-based research inevitably, to some degree at least, casts the children and the participants as the people whose stories are being told. It casts them as objects to some degree. And that raises a moral tension which cannot be done away with. It has to be inhabited with self-reflection, particularly when it comes to using the stories of others to do our scholarly work. And as this quote from Kirsten Bell puts it, the perils of ethnographic fieldwork, as with its promise, stem as much from our humanity as from our identity as a researcher. So soon after leaving China, our family moved to Aotearoa, and I began teaching evidence and Chinese law here. And here again, I thought I would just pause to note that there is an echo of that moral tension in that our research and for our students, their learning in law relies on using the lived experiences of others as case studies for our own purposes. We use those as tools for understanding what the law is and how it has developed. So how did this murder trial develop the rules around character evidence, for example? And people, as connected in whanaungatanga and reciprocity, are at the heart of the law, both in terms of how it has developed, but also in the impacts that it has. And sometimes the legal method that I referred to earlier, at least as constructed from a second law Anglo-New Zealand perspective, can in some respects obscure this. And this was famously explored by Elizabeth Mertz in her really important work on what it does to students when we teach them to think like a lawyer, which I want to return to later. And relatedly, moreover, to think like a lawyer, again in the second law Western worldview at least, is ostensibly to be objective and value neutral. And that assumption that the law is premised on value neutral objective logic is, of course, and has been open to critique on numerous fronts for a long time. So another research and teaching focus of mine in the past 4 years has been feminist legal theory, with a particular focus on the law of consent in New Zealand in the context of sexual violence. And what I wanted to do for this part of the lecture was to give some examples of this, of how feminist theory over time has helped to uncover the values, the value judgments that are embedded in these ostensibly objective, doctrinal, so-called black letter areas of law, such as evidence law. Feminist theory has critiqued and changed our understanding of what can validly be used as proof. I do hasten to add, although I think this is probably already apparent, I'm not taking credit for the feminist critique of evidence law. I'm giving you some well-known examples that have been widely written about and as useful kind of context for my own research. But to begin with a brief primer, evidence law in New Zealand is premised fundamentally on two fundamental ideas. The first is that only relevant evidence should go to the jury, and the second is that sometimes even relevant evidence will nonetheless be excluded because the price to be paid by admitting it is seen as too high. So, for example, something else I've written about is prison informant evidence. We might have evidence from a prison informant or a so-called jailhouse snitch who says, oh yes, the defendant told me that he did it. Well, that would be very compelling evidence. If it was true, it would certainly be relevant. It would tend to prove the defendant's guilt. But as a matter of law, the judge might find that it cannot be used as evidence because there are serious concerns about whether it is true, whether it is reliable, and whether the jury will be able to assess reliability, and whether they'll be able to look past its wow factor. So in the Anglo common law tradition, the idea of relevance, which is that a piece of proof is linked with a particular conclusion or contention, has long been described and considered to be a matter of logic and common sense. You see these phrases used quite often. It's logic and common sense. But the question has to be asked, who's common sense, who's logic? Because by common sense, we tend to mean generalizations, and we can bring that underlying logic to light by using syllogistic reasoning to explain the logic that underpins the linkage of a piece of evidence with a particular conclusion, right? So the most famous example of this would be, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So if in a court of law we're trying to prove that Socrates is mortal, we could offer as evidence that he is a man, and that evidence tends to prove he is mortal because of this premise that links the evidence with the conclusion, the premise that all men are mortal. And of course, that's a premise that is accepted and valid and logically sound. Okay. So far so good. Sometimes assessing relevance is a matter of what everyone just knows to be true. Everyone knows that men are mortal. Everyone knows that you can't be in two places at once, which means an alibi is very much relevant to whether or not someone did the deed, committed the crime. So in other words, sometimes the logic at play will be unimpeachable, but sometimes, however, the logic on which an assertion of relevance is premised is contestable, particularly when we start to consider whose logic the common law has traditionally applied. So I have some examples in the next few slides to illustrate how relevance, far from being neutral and impartial, is, as Kinports puts it here, very much in the eye of the beholder. Good guys don't commit assault. So at common law, it used to be common, particularly in sexual violence trials, to bring general, well, he's a good guy type of evidence. And I am using gendered language here because rape was defined in gendered terms in the common law. And this was used to bolster a defendant's credibility and thereby undermine the complainant's credibility, to suggest that she was simply a woman scorned, a woman, quote unquote, crying rape. And as feminist scholars like Catherine McKinnon and Susan Estrich point out, it is an unfortunate truth that the experience of very many women calls into question this premise. And if the logic is not sound, then the relevance and the importance of this sort of evidence becomes implicated. Unchaste women are immoral and therefore less trustworthy and credible. This was the logic of the common law. The common law said that if a woman had a sexual past, that could be used to undermine her credibility on the basis of this logic here. And you can see how, of course, that underlying logic casts women with a past as the unchaste, the deviant, the shameful other, with devastating results in terms of their assaults being simply illegible to the law. Real victims will complain immediately or act in a certain way or go to the police. Again, the common law equated a failure to immediately complain with a presumption that the complaint was fabricated. To what extent, even today, do jury members continue to bring this common sense logic to the jury room and to their deliberations? And of course, we can question that logic. We can say, well, how valid is this premise from the perspective of a Māori woman in light of ongoing colonial trauma and mistrust, or for a gay person in a heteronormative or indeed outright homophobic social context? Real victims will fight back. This victim did not resist, at least sufficiently, in a way that the law thinks makes sense and is convincing. This victim simply froze, ergo he is not a victim, and this was consensual. So as these examples illustrate, the common sense logic that underpins evidence law is perhaps not so common once the perspectives of previously marginalised othered voices begin to be accounted for. As I've mentioned, I think, there have been numerous reforms, though. We've come a long way. Numerous reforms both to the rules of evidence and also to our substantive law of sexual violence, aimed at redressing the myths and the biased assumptions that for so long have infiltrated the law. In terms of the law of consent, which is one of my current major areas of focus, our Crimes Act was amended in 1985 to provide that a person does not consent just because they did not resist. So you can see there that that's a political choice, a legislative repudiation of the common law's logic, which required victims to resist to prove non-consent. But of course, the law could go further, and many jurisdictions have gone further. We could choose to follow in the footsteps of Canada and various American and Australian jurisdictions and to define consent as something that must always be communicated, as something that is by its nature an external phenomenon, something that doesn't do any work unless it is communicated. And that would essentially, again, amount to a legislative embrace of a new logic that it's never reasonable to assume someone else consents based on their lack of a no, but that it must always be based on some form of yes, communicated by sufficiently clear words or actions. And this is a construction of consent in law at least, as something that's inherently relational and mutual. And there's some really important ongoing work happening in this space. I am going to shift gears now, and by way of a segue, I have another syllogism, which is to introduce the final part of today's lecture, where I wanted to discuss questions of proof that arise for us as academics. For academics who are tasked with producing research outputs, which are by necessity, they have to be evaluated by performance reviews, promotion reviews, etc., there's also a question of evidence that arises here. How do we prove that our research is sufficient and successful? And I wanted to talk to this because here, again, I think my experience has been that there are often some unearthed and unchallenged assumptions that can be at play. And it can be useful to bring those to light and to consider the impact they have on our academic endeavours and choices. So I'm somewhat veering off the traditional research lecture path, although I will come back to another research focus in a moment, because this is something that's very much related to receiving an accolade like this. I think research honours are wonderful. They're a lovely way that we as a collegiate institution, where we care about each other and we celebrate each other's success, we can highlight through awards a diversity of research that is happening. And it can be one way to encourage people and to say your work is seen and it's valued. And that can be particularly important for early career colleagues, because the stories that we tell ourselves and each other about our work matter a great deal in terms of whether we persevere when challenges arise. So my experience in the Faculty of Law since I arrived in 2017 has been a really, really fortunate one. I've always had that encouragement because, in part, almost everything I've sent out for peer review, at least in the early days, was read by a colleague. I really greatly admire and trust the opinions of my colleagues. They've been very generous with their expertise and time. To give one example, when I was writing my book in my first year, both Stuart Anderson and Nicola Peart, who are formidable legal minds, they read every word and they gave me some really incredibly insightful feedback. And that's not a small ask of busy academics. So for me, seeing my work through the eyes of discerning and rigorous and encouraging colleagues has been really important. There's often a lot of rigor and discernment from peer reviewers and not so much encouragement. And having my colleagues alongside has been a really helpful corrective against narratives of self-doubt that I'm sure at least some of you are also familiar with. Self-doubt has always been part of my research process. It's been something that I have to push through. And I thought that there might be some value in sharing that vulnerability today in case others feel the same way, because it can be a lonely experience. And I also share it with my students. Our law students, some are here today, are a wonderful group of students. They also, to generalize, can have tendencies towards competitiveness and perfectionism. I'm not criticizing, I think it's sort of a function of who chooses to do law. And in my role as convener of student experience, I often see our students being really hard on themselves. And in part, that might be because they're in a system which often, perhaps unintentionally, and to some degree necessarily, causes them to focus on externalities as measures of their success, and for some, therefore, as measures of their self-worth. Things like GPA, lines on the CV, did I win the moot, how many job offers did I get, etc. So one final research interest that I wanted to speak to today, and this is something which I've also published on, albeit briefly, but have been putting into practice in my teaching here at Otago, is how mindfulness and contemplative practices can be used pedagogically to help students with lots of different things like focus, empathy, resilience, but also to help them with reorienting their academic endeavours towards internal motivations, to try to stay connected with their values. And for some, that might be about achieving a certain ambition. There's nothing wrong with that. But for others, they come to law school driven by a certain sense of purpose or altruism. And there is some concerning research from the US and elsewhere showing that law schools, with their culture of competition and conformity, I'm quoting Susan Sturman-Lani-Guinea there, can beat this out of students. Sometimes we fall short in encouraging our students to develop internally generated measures of accomplishment. Sometimes we fall short in cultivating a contextual, compassionate, empathetic view of how law impacts people. As Conley puts it in this review of Mertz's Think Like a Lawyer, which I mentioned earlier, when we teach our students to think like a lawyer, it turns out this is not such a value-neutral thing. When we teach them to think like a lawyer, we may inadvertently strip them of the values that motivated them to study law and subtly inculcate new ones while undermining empathy. So, returning to my theme, question of proof here, what about for academics? When we as academics find ourselves likewise in a culture that in some ways encourages competition, and in some ways, not all, is defined by external metrics like H factors and journal rankings and number of outputs and grant money and, yes, awards, how do we resist the narrative that these are the only metrics of success or that they are the most important ones? And how do we also stay connected, if we choose and want to do so, to our values, to the intrinsic motivations and rewards of research? I think I have found it can be really intrinsically rewarding and motivating. I would hazard that we all have a cause for our research. As lawyers, our cause is justice, if we want to distill it down to one word. And we can contribute to justice in different ways in our work. But if external metrics become all-consuming, that can be obscured. We can find ourselves too caught up in those external metrics. So I use mindfulness to these ends, both personally but also in my classroom. It's always optional for those who are willing to try or find it useful, which is not everybody, it's not for everybody. But it can be used to help students combat self-doubt and competition, to stay connected to their values and intrinsic sources of motivation, to help them wrestle with and not lose sight of the human side of these cases that we're using in our learning, and also to think about how they are going to define success for themselves. And in my own research journey, I've found mindfulness helps me notice when self-doubt is at play and to just sit with that discomfort and choose to persevere nonetheless. I am not a researcher who finds research and writing always comes easily, despite the syllogistic reasoning that might suggest this is so. There can be fear and worry at play when I sit down to write. I'm worried this will sound grandiose and it may not resonate with everyone, but for me, sometimes writing is an act of courage because it's an act of creation, and creative work can be scary. You're putting your work out into the world for others to pick apart. It can be scary to start with a blank page and to know you have a deadline and to try to write against the void, as it's described in Walking on Alligators. And mindfulness is helpful for me. So what I'm trying to be transparent about is that fear and anxiety is sometimes just part of my process. And as Bales and Orland describe in this excellent book, Art and Fear, as writers, we carry real and imagined critics with us constantly, a veritable babel of voices, some remembered, some prophesied, and each eager to comment on all we do. Of course, constructive criticism and commentary is really important. It's essential to what we do as academics, engaging in academic dialogue. And I think to whatever extent our research is strong and rigorous, it's probably in part because we're listening to those voices, we're anticipating the criticism, we're noticing the shortcomings and weaknesses in our arguments and making them stronger. So they can be really productive. But likewise, the comments, particularly of the notorious reviewer too, whether they are praising us or seemingly trying to take us down, and which sounds hyperbolic, but it can feel that way sometimes. Those comments and the opinions and views of others are externalities that can obscure our internal motivation. So as I often tell my students, how you speak to yourself and about yourself really matters. And in mindfulness, they can take a breath, and in that breath find space to choose a different narrative, one that's grounded in both humility and kindness, including to ourselves. Speaking of kindness, one of the briefs for today was to share with you the people who have influenced my research journey. And while it's, again, cliched to say, there are probably too many to name individually, that would certainly include my family. My parents are both teachers, every teacher that I've ever had, my PhD supervisors at Oxford, colleagues and mentors from my time in Chicago, including Terry Halliday. Here at Otago, I've already acknowledged that the Faculty of Law, I think, is a really special place to be. My colleagues are brilliant and generous and very fun to work with. I think the faculty is full of inspiring people, which is in part evidenced by the fact that 50% of current Otago DVCs are women from the Faculty of Law. I'm grateful to Paola for welcoming me to the China Club at Otago and being a one-of-a-kind cheerleader. I'm co-director of the Otago Centre for Law and Society with Ben and Chantal and Bridget Toy-Cronin, who are the absolute dream team to work with. I've made many friendships across the university, and if it's not already apparent, I also really like our students. I think that they're really great and inspiring. For me, staying connected to values and intrinsic motivation is made much easier by belonging to the Knox community. So thank you to all of you for being here today, including people who've become family to us here in Aotearoa and supported us in the absence of our American and Australian families. And there's one adopted grandparent in particular who I know would have really loved to be here today. Thank you to everyone for coming today at a busy time of year, including family and friends watching online. I think my kids should be coming in shortly. I didn't want them to listen to some of this content, but I asked my kids if they knew what I do, and Maggie said, well, you're a lawyer, and Fred said, what's a lawyer? And, and Maggie, without skipping a beat, said, lawyers are people who tell other people they're wrong. So there's something about justice there in the words of an 8-year-old. I must confess I do tell people they're wrong fairly often, but my amazing family put up with that and helped me with adding some kindness and humility along the way. So thank you. Ngā mihi nui.
I'll take a seat. Oh, thank you so much, Anna. That was fantastic, wonderful, and everything else in between. I have an unenviable role of now trying to wrap things up. But what you've done is got lots of tangents that I will go on for a little while. When you talk about telling people they're wrong, I'm reminded of having the great privilege of hearing a Nobel laureate speak in the field of theoretical physics. He had transferred from philosophy, which he argued was a case where people are arguing with each other to try and prove who's wrong. But to evidence, he said what he loved about theoretical physics is you could develop a theory that was tested by evidence, and that if you were wrong, you weren't stupid. But also to referee too, it reminded me on another tangent of my first review as a doctoral student, where the words that will never leave me are naive phenomenological approach and experimental results seem to have been added as an afterthought. So after much battle we got that through. So that humaneness of the research experience is one that I could reflect on. What you've done though is you've taken us through a journey through your academic career, and you've demonstrated to us the full, the rounded, the very caring and deep thinking academic that you are. You care very much for us by firstly not saying what you really do in your research when you read through detailed judgments and try and flow through that very detailed and technical work that you do, but rather you lifted us to different levels in what you do. And in particular, I think we all appreciated that connection to what it is and means to be a university academic, to connect teaching to research and to practice, and that you've got this trifecta, triumvirate, holy trinity, whatever you like to call it, the 3-in-1, very, very clearly exemplified. And what you did tonight is the evidence that backs up the logic of the panel that leads to the conclusion that you are a worthy recipient. What the panel very much liked was that your work is leading research. It is grounded with good metrics. You are publishing in appropriate outlets, and you are publishing at the right level to receive this award. But you very much ground that in engagement with students and with the profession, that your work with the profession, both advising on things like the third review of the Evidence Acts, but being a very valued member of the Judicial Studies Institute to teach judges about evidence as well, that you wanted to develop a strand of your research because you were given a course to teach, because you were teaching evidence, you needed to develop research in that, and that taking very seriously that aspect of research-informed teaching is what we saw very much. You have presented to us a logic of evidence and proof that actually works across many disciplines. I'm thinking of our mathematicians, who also have very structured forms of ways to go from conjecture to proof through structured and evidential linkages. I could say a lot more, but I think it is right for us to ask that by acclamation we see whether you have passed the test, and worthy for me to invite the Vice-Chancellor up to receive this award. Who thinks we should go with the next step? So with that, congratulations. I'll invite the Vice-Chancellor, Honourable Grant Robertson, to present you with a Carl Smith Medal, a copy of the book by Carl Smith, and something framed to allow you to remember the evening. So Grant, could you do the honours? And in closing, thank you for all coming. To those that are present in person, could you please feel free to join us at the Staff Club for refreshments. Apologies to those that are online, unless you can make a very speedy trip to Dunedin. We'll hold something for you, or you can have a celebration with Anna at the next occasion. So finally, congratulations and well done again, Anna. Thank you very much.